I let them take everything. That was the story my son and daughter-in-law told themselves as they sat in the front row of the attorney's office, smiling as if they had already crossed the finish line. I remember the way Melissa folded her hands neatly on the polished oak table, her wedding ring catching the afternoon sunlight. Jason sat beside her, relaxed for the first time since his father's funeral 3 weeks earlier. They thought the hard part was over. They thought the future belonged to them. And most of all, they thought I was too heartbroken, too tired, and too old to notice what they were doing. What they didn't know was that my late husband had always paid attention to details, even the smallest ones. The conference room smelled faintly of coffee and paper. Outside the window, traffic moved slowly through downtown Cincinnati as another gray autumn afternoon settled over the city. I sat quietly at the far end of the table, my purse resting in my lap. At 71 years old, I had learned something important about people. When they believe they have won, they stop hiding who they really are. Thomas Bennett, the attorney who had handled my husband's affairs for years, adjusted his glasses and opened a thick folder. The room grew still. My husband, Richard Brooks, had spent 46 years building a life with me. Together we raised a son, paid off a mortgage, planted maple trees in the backyard, and saved carefully for retirement. We were never flashy people. We believed in responsibility, loyalty, and keeping our promises. Richard used to say that character revealed itself during difficult times. Looking at Jason and Melissa that afternoon, I wondered what he would think if he could see them now. Thomas began reading. His voice remained steady and professional as he reviewed the estate documents. Every sentence seemed to make Melissa sit a little taller. Every page made Jason more confident. I noticed the glances they exchanged. Small smiles. Quiet nods. The kind people share when they believe everything is going according to plan. Then came the house. The house Richard and I had lived in for 38 years. The house where Jason took his first steps. The house where every Christmas morning and every Thanksgiving dinner had unfolded beneath the same roof. Melissa lowered her eyes for a moment, pretending humility, but I caught the satisfaction hidden behind her expression. Jason cleared his throat and shifted in his chair. He was trying to appear respectful, but excitement kept leaking through the cracks. Neither of them looked at me. Not once. That hurt more than I expected. Grief had already taken my husband. Now it felt as though something else was slipping away too. Something harder to define. Respect. Gratitude. Family. Thomas continued reading while I listened in silence. A younger version of me might have spoken up. She might have demanded explanations. She might have asked why her son seemed so eager to move forward before the flowers from the funeral had even faded. But age teaches patience. Sometimes silence reveals more than questions ever could. As the meeting went on, Melissa began discussing renovation ideas as though decisions had already been finalized. She mentioned opening walls, replacing cabinets, and converting my sewing room into a home office. Jason didn't stop her. In fact, he joined the conversation. They talked about my home as if I were no longer part of it. I simply folded my hands and listened. The strange thing was that I wasn't angry. Not yet. I was observing, watching, learning. Because the more they talked, the more certain I became that they had overlooked something important. A memory surfaced then. Richard sitting at the kitchen table 6 months before his passing, reviewing paperwork long after dinner. I had asked why he seemed so focused. He smiled and tapped a stack of documents. Most people only read what they expect to see, he told me. That's why details matter. At the time, I thought nothing of it. Now those words echoed in my mind. Across the table, Melissa laughed softly at something Jason whispered. They looked relieved. Victorious. Certain. Thomas eventually closed the folder and paused. For a brief second, his eyes met mine. There was something unusual in his expression. Something careful. Deliberate. Then he glanced toward another document resting beneath the stack. Melissa never noticed. Jason didn't either. They were too busy celebrating a future they believed was already theirs. I sat back in my chair and offered the smallest smile. They thought they had taken everything. The house, the savings, the future they imagined for themselves. But as I looked around that room, I realized they had missed the same thing that many people miss when greed gets involved. They had stopped paying attention. And somewhere inside that folder rested a single line that was about to change everything. The meeting ended less than an hour later, but the silence that followed stayed with me all the way home. Jason offered to drive me, although he spent most of the trip talking about practical matters. property taxes, maintenance costs, future plans. Melissa sat in the front passenger seat scrolling through pictures on her phone. Every now and then she would turn the screen toward Jason and smile. Neither of them seemed interested in what I was feeling. I sat in the back seat looking out the window as familiar streets rolled by. The city looked exactly the same as it had the week before, yet everything felt different. The maple trees lining the sidewalks had begun turning shades of gold and red. Small family-owned stores displayed autumn decorations in their windows. People carried grocery bags and hurried through crosswalks. Life continued moving forward. Mine seemed to have paused. When we pulled into my driveway, Jason finally looked at me through the rearview mirror. "You are doing okay, right, Mom?" he asked. The question sounded rehearsed, almost like an obligation. I smiled softly. "I am fine." He nodded as though relieved by the answer. Melissa never turned around. "We should probably start making plans soon," she said casually. "There is a lot to organize." Organize. Such a simple word. Yet somehow it sounded as though my entire life had become a project on her calendar. I thanked Jason for the ride and stepped out of the car. Neither of them offered to come inside. Within seconds, they were backing out of the driveway and heading down the street. I stood there watching until their car disappeared around the corner. Then I turned toward the house. The house felt quieter than usual. Ever since Richard passed away, every room carried a different kind of silence. Not the peaceful silence we used to enjoy on Sunday mornings with coffee and newspapers. This silence felt unfinished. I walked into the kitchen and automatically reached for 2 mugs before stopping myself. Old habits linger long after people are gone. I put 1 mug back into the cabinet and stood there for a moment staring at the empty space beside it. Richard had always sat at the same spot at the breakfast table. 46 years together creates routines so deeply rooted that they become part of who you are. I made myself a cup of tea and carried it into the living room. The grandfather clock near the staircase ticked steadily. The same clock Richard's father had owned before him. Across from it stood a bookshelf filled with photo albums. Family vacations, birthdays, graduations, memories carefully preserved over decades. I should have felt comforted by those reminders. Instead, I found myself studying the photographs more closely than ever before, looking for signs I might have missed, looking for the moment things began changing. The truth was that Jason had not always been distant. As a boy, he had been thoughtful and kind. He used to leave handwritten notes on the refrigerator before school. He never forgot birthdays. He called every Sunday after moving away for college. Even after marrying Melissa, things seemed normal at first. Then little changes appeared. Calls became shorter. Visits became less frequent. Decisions started being made without me. One memory returned clearly that evening. 2 years earlier, I had invited them for Thanksgiving dinner. Melissa insisted on hosting instead. She said it would be easier. During the meal, she joked repeatedly about how large my house was for one older couple. Everyone laughed politely. Richard did not. Later that night, he stood by the kitchen sink drying dishes and said something that puzzled me at the time. "People often tell you exactly what they want if you listen carefully." I asked what he meant. He simply smiled and changed the subject. Sitting alone in the living room now, I wondered whether he had seen something I refused to see. My thoughts were interrupted by the ringing of the telephone. I glanced at the caller identification. Grace Sullivan, my oldest friend. We had known each other for nearly 50 years. She could hear something was wrong before I even said hello. "How did the meeting go?" she asked gently. I looked toward the darkening window. Exactly the way they expected it to. Grace was quiet for a moment. "And what do you expect, Eleanor?" I thought about Thomas Bennett's expression when he glanced at that final document. I thought about Richard reviewing paperwork late into the evening. I thought about the confidence on Melissa's face and the certainty in Jason's voice. Then I took a slow sip of tea. "I think," I said carefully, "that this story is not finished yet." The next morning I woke before sunrise, something I had done almost every day since Richard passed away. The house was still dark. For a few seconds, caught between sleep and reality, I almost expected to hear him moving around in the kitchen. Instead, there was only silence. I wrapped a cardigan around my shoulders and made coffee. The familiar routine helped steady me. Outside, a light rain tapped against the windows. Autumn had settled in fully now. The backyard maple trees swayed gently in the wind, their leaves scattered across the lawn Richard had always taken such pride in maintaining. I carried my coffee to the breakfast table and found myself staring at the empty chair across from me. So many conversations had happened there over the years. Discussions about bills, vacations, retirement plans, and Jason. Especially Jason. Looking back, the changes had not happened all at once. They had arrived quietly, one small step at a time. A canceled visit here. A forgotten phone call there. Tiny moments that seemed harmless on their own. Together, they told a different story. Around mid-morning, I decided to organize some paperwork in Richard's study. The room remained exactly as he had left it. His reading glasses still rested on the corner of the desk. A yellow legal pad sat beside them covered with neat handwritten notes. I had not touched much since his passing. At first the grief was too fresh. Later, I convinced myself there was no rush. As I sorted through folders, I remembered a conversation from nearly a year earlier. Jason and Melissa had come over for dinner. At one point, Melissa wandered through the house, commenting on possible renovations. She spoke as though she were touring a property rather than visiting family. This room could be opened up, she had said while standing in the living room. And the kitchen would look amazing with a large island. Richard exchanged a glance with me, but said nothing. Later that evening, after they left, he stood at the sink looking out into the backyard. "Did you notice something?" he asked. I remember laughing softly. What exactly am I supposed to notice? He dried his hands with a dish towel and shrugged. Never mind. At the time I thought he was being overly cautious. Richard was never suspicious by nature, but he paid attention. Details mattered to him. Patterns mattered. I continued sorting papers until the telephone rang. It was Grace again. She invited me to lunch at a small diner we had visited for years. By noon I found myself sitting across from her in a booth near the window. The restaurant smelled of fresh soup and baked bread. Families chatted quietly around us, while servers moved between tables carrying steaming plates. Grace listened patiently as I described the meeting with Thomas. When I finished, she stirred her tea thoughtfully. "You know," she said, "Richard talked to me once about Jason and Melissa." I looked up immediately. "When?" "A few months ago." My stomach tightened. Grace rarely spoke dramatically. If she brought something up, it mattered. "What did he say?" She hesitated before answering. "He said he was worried about how interested Melissa seemed in things that did not belong to her." I sat very still. Grace continued carefully. He was not angry. He was disappointed. He felt like she saw every relationship as a transaction. Her words lingered between us. I thought about the way Melissa discussed my house. The way she spoke about future plans before anything had officially changed. The way Jason followed her. Led more often than his own instincts. Did Richard say anything else? I asked. Grace nodded slowly. He told me that if something ever seemed strange after he was gone, I should trust him. I frowned. Trust him how? He did not explain. She offered a small smile. "You know, Richard, when he had a reason for doing something, he rarely announced it." On the drive home, Grace's words echoed in my thoughts. Trust him. By late afternoon, I found myself standing once again inside Richard's study. The rain had stopped. Sunlight filtered through the window and illuminated the desk. I looked around the room differently now. Not as a widow preserving memories. As someone searching for answers. Then my eyes landed on a small locked drawer built into the side of the desk. A drawer I had never opened. And suddenly, for the first time since the attorney's meeting, I felt certain that Richard had been preparing for something long before any of us realized it. I stood in front of the desk for a long moment before reaching for the small brass handle. The drawer was locked, which immediately struck me as unusual. Richard had never been secretive. Organized, yes. Careful, absolutely. But secretive was not a word anyone would have used to describe him. I searched the desk methodically, opening compartments and sorting through neatly arranged folders. Everything was exactly the way he would have left it. Tax records, insurance documents, property receipts. Every paper labeled in his precise handwriting. Then I remembered something. Years ago, Richard bought a small wooden box during a weekend trip to Vermont. He kept it on the highest shelf of the study bookcase. I had not thought about that box in years. Standing on a small step stool, I carefully pulled it down. Inside were old photographs, a few military keepsakes from his father, and a tiny silver key. My pulse quickened. The key fit the drawer perfectly. When the lock clicked open, I felt an unexpected wave of emotion. It was as though Richard had reached across time and placed something directly into my hands. Inside the drawer sat a single manila envelope. Nothing else. No stacks of paperwork. No hidden fortune. Just one envelope with my name written neatly across the front. Eleanor. I sat down in his chair before opening it. My hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from anticipation. The letter inside was only a few pages long. Richard's familiar handwriting covered every line. Dear Eleanor, if you are reading this, then certain things have happened exactly as I feared they might. I stopped reading for a moment. The room suddenly felt smaller. Outside the window, a breeze stirred fallen leaves across the yard. I continued. Richard wrote about family, about trust, about how grief sometimes reveals truths that comfort tends to hide. He explained that during the previous 2 years he had become increasingly concerned about Melissa's interest in our finances. Not because she asked questions. Responsible people ask questions. What troubled him was her assumption that everything would eventually belong to her and Jason. Richard described conversations I barely remembered. Casual comments about inheritance. Remarks about downsizing. Questions about investment accounts that seemed harmless at the time. Reading them all together painted a different picture. Then came the part that made me put the letter down entirely. Richard admitted he had consulted Thomas Bennet several times without telling me. He wanted to make certain that his wishes would be protected no matter what happened after his death. Protected from what? I wondered. Protected from whom? The answer sat plainly on the page in front of me. He was not protecting assets. He was protecting people. Specifically me. Tears filled my eyes, but they were not tears of sadness. They came from realizing that even during his final months, Richard had been thinking ahead, looking out for me, loving me in the quiet, practical way he always had. At the bottom of the letter was a handwritten note. Trust Thomas. Read everything, especially the last page. I stared at those words for a long time. Especially the last page. The same phrase echoed what he had once told me at the kitchen table. Most people only read what they expect to see. Details matter. Suddenly the attorney's office replayed in my mind. Melissa smiling. Jason relaxing. Into confidence. The brief glance Thomas had given me. The document beneath the others. A document nobody seemed interested in discussing. My phone rang just then. The sudden sound startled me. It was Thomas Bennet. For a moment neither of us spoke. Then he cleared his throat. Mrs. Brooks, I was hoping you might have some time tomorrow afternoon. I glanced at Richard's letter still resting in my lap. I think I can make time. There was a pause. Good, Thomas replied carefully. There are a few items regarding Richard's estate that deserve a closer review. He chose his words with precision, the same way Richard always did. Were those items discussed at the meeting? I asked. Another pause. Not completely. After we ended the call, I walked through the house slowly. For the first time since Richard's passing, I no longer felt like someone drifting through uncertainty. Questions remained, certainly, but now I knew something important. Richard had seen the danger long before I did. He had prepared for it. And somewhere inside the estate documents was a piece of the puzzle that Jason and Melissa had never bothered to look for because they believed the story was already over. What they did not understand was that the final chapter had not even begun. The following afternoon, I drove downtown to Thomas Bennet's office alone. The sky was clear for the first time in days, but I felt strangely calm. Not hopeful, not anxious, simply ready. The receptionist greeted me warmly and escorted me to a smaller conference room than the one used for the estate meeting. This room felt more private, more deliberate. Thomas was already waiting when I arrived. A thick folder sat on the table beside him. He stood when I entered and offered a sympathetic smile. Thank you for coming, Eleanor. I took my seat and placed Richard's letter on the table. Thomas noticed it immediately. His expression softened. So you found it? I nodded. Richard wanted me to trust you. Thomas looked down briefly before meeting my eyes again. Your husband was one of the most thoughtful men I have ever known. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then Thomas opened the folder. There are some things Richard instructed me not to discuss unless certain circumstances developed after his passing. My heart beat a little faster. What circumstances? Thomas carefully removed a document from the folder. Evidence that people were more interested in receiving his assets than honoring his wishes. I thought about Melissa discussing renovations before the estate process was even complete. I thought about Jason avoiding eye contact while talking about my future as though I were no longer capable of making decisions. Suddenly, Richard's concerns seemed less abstract. Thomas slid several pages toward me. They contained notes from meetings he and Richard had held over the previous 18 months. Not personal notes. Legal notes. Records of questions Richard asked. Protections he requested. scenarios he wanted addressed. The deeper I read, the more clearly I understood what he had been doing. He had not been trying to punish anyone. He had been trying to prevent something. He never told me any of this, I said quietly. Thomas nodded. He hoped it would never become necessary. I continued reading. One entry caught my attention immediately. Richard had specifically instructed Thomas to observe behavior following his death before releasing certain information. Not because he distrusted family, because he believed character revealed itself under pressure. I almost laughed at how perfectly that sounded like him. For 46 years, Richard believed actions mattered more than words. The pages confirmed it. Thomas leaned back in his chair. There is something else you should know. He reached for another document. About 6 months ago, Richard asked me a very specific question. I looked up. What question? He asked whether a person who inherited property could lose access to that inheritance if they violated certain conditions. I stared at him. Conditions? Thomas folded his hands carefully. Legal conditions established by the property owner. My pulse quickened. Suddenly, the memory of Melissa's confidence during the estate meeting seemed almost surreal. She had behaved like someone already spending money she did not yet possess. Thomas continued. Richard spent considerable time reviewing those options. Outside the window, I could see people walking along the sidewalk carrying briefcases and coffee cups. Ordinary lives continuing as normal. Meanwhile, the story unfolding in front of me felt anything but ordinary. Did he ever explain why? I asked. Thomas gave a small smile. He said he wanted to make sure that loyalty remained more valuable than greed. Those words settled heavily in the room. Loyalty remained more valuable than greed. That sounded exactly like the man I married. Not dramatic, not vindictive, simply fair. Then Thomas handed me a final document. Unlike the others, this one remained sealed. My name appeared across the front in Richard's handwriting. He instructed me to give this to you only after our conversation today, Thomas explained. I carefully turned the envelope over in my hands. The paper felt surprisingly heavy, as though it carried more than words inside. Before opening it, I looked at Thomas. Should I be worried? For the first time all afternoon, he smiled openly. No, Eleanor. His voice was calm and confident. I think you should be patient. When I left the office an hour later, the sealed envelope rested safely inside my purse. The city looked different somehow. Not because anything had changed outside, because something had changed inside me. For weeks I had felt like a woman watching her life slowly slip away. Now I realized Richard had been building a safety net long before I knew I would need one. And somewhere inside the envelope resting beside me was another piece of the truth. A truth Jason and Melissa still knew nothing about. For the next several days I said nothing to Jason or Melissa about my meeting with Thomas. I answered their calls politely. I listened when they talked about schedules and future plans. Most importantly, I paid attention. It amazed me how much people reveal when they believe there is nothing left to hide. 3 days after my meeting with Thomas, Jason called to ask whether he and Melissa could stop by the house on Saturday. His voice sounded unusually cheerful. I agreed. When they arrived that afternoon, Melissa carried a notebook filled with ideas. She sat at my kitchen table and began discussing paint colors, flooring options, and furniture layouts. At one point, she even sketched a rough floor plan on a sheet of paper. I watched quietly while she transformed rooms that still held decades of family memories into renovation projects. The strange thing was that neither of them seemed uncomfortable. They did not act like people discussing possibilities. They acted like owners. Jason eventually walked into the living room and stood near the fireplace. Dad always loved this room, he said. Then he glanced around thoughtfully. Although opening up the wall would probably make it feel bigger. Melissa smiled. Exactly what I was thinking. I stirred my tea and listened. The fireplace had been built the year Jason turned 10. Richard spent 3 weekends laying stone by hand. Every mark in that room carried a story. Yet to Melissa, it was simply square footage. After they left, I sat alone at the kitchen table looking at the sketches she forgot to take with her. There was something unsettling about seeing my life reduced to measurements and remodeling estimates. Still, I did not feel angry. If anything, I felt increasingly certain that Richard had understood this situation long before I had. The following week brought even more surprises. Grace called one evening and mentioned that she had seen Melissa at a home furnishing store across town. Apparently, she had been discussing delivery timelines with a sales associate. When Grace casually asked whether she was redecorating, Melissa reportedly smiled and said, "We are preparing for a new chapter." A new chapter. The phrase stayed with me, not because it was cruel, because it revealed certainty. Certainty based on assumptions. Meanwhile, the sealed envelope from Thomas remained unopened inside my desk drawer. More than once I considered reading it immediately. Every time I reached for it, I remembered Richard's note. "Trust Thomas. Be patient." So I waited. Patience had become its own kind of strength. On Thursday morning, another call came from Thomas. He informed me that several final administrative reviews would be completed early the following week. His tone remained professional, but I sensed something beneath it. Confidence. "Everything is proceeding exactly as Richard intended," he said. That single sentence stayed with me for the rest of the day. Exactly as Richard intended. Not as Melissa intended. Not as Jason expected. As Richard intended. By Friday afternoon, Jason called again. This time he sounded excited. He mentioned meeting with a contractor. He spoke about long-term plans. He even asked whether I had started considering smaller housing options for myself. I nearly smiled at the irony. My son was planning a future based on information he did not actually possess. Yet I could hear no hesitation in his voice. No uncertainty. He truly believed the outcome had already been decided. After we ended the call, I walked through the house slowly. The family photographs remained exactly where they had always been. Richard's favorite chair still sat beside the window overlooking the backyard. The grandfather clock continued its steady rhythm. Nothing had changed, yet everything was changing. That evening I finally opened the desk drawer and removed the sealed envelope Thomas had given me. I held it in my hands for several moments before carefully breaking the seal. Inside was a single folded document and a brief handwritten note from Richard. My breath caught as I recognized his handwriting immediately. The note contained only one sentence. "Eleanor, if they are celebrating now, it means they still have not found the line." Beneath the note rested the document itself. I unfolded the first page slowly. The heading at the top immediately told me what I was looking at. It was an amendment. An amendment that nobody except Richard, Thomas, and now me seemed to know existed. For several minutes, I simply stared at the amendment. The words were clear, precise, entirely consistent with the man I had known for nearly half a century. Richard never believed in dramatic gestures. He believed in responsibility. He believed that privileges came with obligations. And hidden within the amendment was the line he had referenced in his note. The line nobody had bothered to look for. I read it once, then twice, then a third time just to make certain I understood exactly what it meant. The amendment stated that any transfer of the family residence and several associated assets would remain conditional for a period of 12 months following Richard's death. During that time, the beneficiary was required to maintain specific responsibilities toward the surviving spouse. Failure to do so would immediately trigger a different distribution structure outlined in a secondary trust arrangement. I sat back in my chair and closed my eyes. Suddenly, dozens of confusing moments made sense. Richard had not been trying to control anyone. He had simply created a test. A fair one. No impossible demands. No tricks. Just a simple expectation that family should behave like family. The more I reviewed the document, the clearer everything became. Jason and Melissa had focused on ownership. They had focused on inheritance. They had focused on what they believed they would receive. What they failed to examine were the conditions attached to receiving it. The following Monday, Thomas called again. This time his voice carried a noticeable sense of purpose. "I believe we should schedule one final review meeting," he said. I already knew why. "Will Jason and Melissa be there?" I asked. "Yes," he replied. "I think that would be appropriate." After the call ended, I placed the amendment back inside the envelope and returned it to the desk drawer. Then I went about my day as usual. I watered the plants. I folded laundry. I made dinner for one. Yet beneath those ordinary activities ran a quiet current of certainty. For the first time since Richard's death, I knew exactly where I stood. Meanwhile, Jason and Melissa seemed to be moving in the opposite direction. Their confidence continued growing. 2 days later, Jason stopped by unexpectedly. He arrived carrying coffee and a cheerful attitude that felt strangely out of place. We sat in the kitchen while he talked about future projects. At one point, he mentioned meeting with a financial advisor. Later, he discussed potential remodeling timelines. The entire conversation revolved around plans extending months into the future. Not once did he ask how I was coping. Not once did he ask, whether I needed anything. As I listened, I found myself remembering the boy who used to bring me homemade birthday cards covered in crooked handwriting. Somewhere along the way, that boy had been replaced by a man who viewed life through spreadsheets and projections. Before leaving, Jason glanced around the kitchen. You know, Mom, eventually it might be easier if you started simplifying things around here. Simplifying things. Another polite phrase carrying a much larger meaning. I smiled gently. Maybe. He seemed satisfied with that answer. The next evening, Grace came over for dinner. We sat on the back patio watching the sun sink behind the maple trees. I told her about the amendment. Not every detail. Just enough. She listened carefully before shaking her head in admiration. That sounds exactly like Richard. I smiled. It does. Grace looked toward the house. Do you think they know? No, I answered. I think they stopped reading as soon as they found the words they wanted to see. Grace laughed softly. People do that more often than they realize. Later that night, after she left, I walked through the quiet house once more. The grandfather clock marked each passing second. Family photographs lined the hallway. Memories remained everywhere. Yet now those memories felt less painful. Richard was gone, but his wisdom remained. His foresight remained. Most importantly, his final lesson remained. Character reveals itself when nobody thinks they are being tested. 3 days later, the notice for the final meeting arrived. The date was set. The time was confirmed. And for the first time since this entire ordeal began, I found myself looking forward to what came next. Because somewhere across town, Jason and Melissa were still celebrating a victory that did not exist. They believed they had already reached the end of the story. They had no idea the most important page had not even been read yet. The morning of the final meeting arrived cold and clear. Frost clung to the edges of the grass outside my kitchen window, and the maple trees stood nearly bare now. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat quietly at the table where Richard and I had shared thousands of mornings together. Strangely, I felt no nervousness. Weeks earlier, I would have dreaded this day. Now I simply felt ready. By 10 o'clock, I was walking into Thomas Bennett's office once again. The same conference room awaited us. The same polished table. The same city skyline beyond the windows. Only the atmosphere felt different. Jason and Melissa were already there when I arrived. Melissa wore a bright smile and carried a leather folder tucked beneath her arm. Jason stood when he saw me and offered a quick hug. It felt more like courtesy than affection. "Good morning, Mom," he said. "Good morning," I replied. Melissa greeted me warmly enough, but there was an unmistakable confidence in her voice. She looked like someone attending a celebration rather than a legal review. Thomas entered a few moments later carrying several folders. After everyone was seated, he began reviewing administrative details. Taxes, trust records, account transfers, routine matters. Melissa listened attentively at first, but her attention seemed focused on reaching the conclusion she expected. Several times I noticed her glance toward Jason with quiet excitement. Eventually Thomas reached the final section. The room grew noticeably still. He opened a separate folder and adjusted his glasses. "There is one additional document that must be addressed before any distributions can be finalized." For the first time that morning, Melissa looked surprised. Jason frowned slightly. "Additional document?" he asked. Thomas nodded. "An amendment executed by Richard Brooks and properly incorporated into the estate plan." Melissa's smile faded. "Only slightly. But I saw it." Thomas continued calmly. "This amendment establishes specific conditions attached to certain inherited assets, including the family residence and related holdings." Jason straightened in his chair. Melissa exchanged a quick glance with him. Neither spoke. Thomas began reading. His voice remained steady and professional. The amendment outlined Richard's intention that family assets remain connected to family responsibilities. It described expectations regarding support, respect, and care for the surviving spouse during the 12-month period following his death. Every sentence seemed to drain a little more certainty from the opposite side of the table. Then Thomas reached the line Richard had referenced, the line nobody had bothered to read, the line hidden in plain sight all along. Thomas explained that failure to meet those conditions automatically redirected ownership through a secondary trust arrangement specifically designed to protect the surviving spouse. Silence filled the room. Complete silence. Jason blinked several times as if trying to process what he had just heard. Melissa's expression became perfectly still. Thomas continued reading factual details. Dates, requirements, legal language, documentation. None of it sounded dramatic. That was the remarkable part. Richard had not created a trap. He had created a safeguard. A safeguard based entirely on behavior. When Thomas finally finished, nobody spoke for several seconds. Then Jason cleared his throat. I do not understand. Thomas folded his hands. The conditions were not satisfied. Melissa leaned forward immediately. What conditions? Her voice remained controlled, but tension had begun creeping into the edges. Thomas referred to his notes. He outlined specific examples. Discussions regarding displacement from the family residence. Documented efforts to pressure housing decisions. Repeated assumptions of ownership prior to fulfillment of estate conditions. Statements witnessed by multiple individuals. Meeting records. Communications. Observations. Everything had been carefully preserved. I watched as realization slowly settled over both of them. Not shock. Realization. The kind that arrives when someone suddenly understands that the story they believed was finished has only now reached its turning point. Melissa sat back in her chair. Jason stared down at the table. For weeks they had been planning renovations, discussing investments, imagining futures. Yet the entire foundation beneath those plans had been built on an assumption. Across the table, Thomas closed the folder. His work was finished. The room remained quiet. Outside the window, traffic moved through downtown Cincinnati exactly as it had. Every other day, life continued. But inside that conference room, everything had changed. And for the first time since Richard's passing, I saw something in Jason's eyes that had been missing for a very long time. Not confidence. Not entitlement. Reflection. The meeting ended quietly. There were no dramatic speeches. No raised voices. No grand declarations. That was never Richard's style, and over the years it had become mine as well. Jason remained seated long after Thomas closed the final folder. Melissa stared at the table, her expression unreadable. For the first time since Richard's passing, neither of them seemed certain about what to say next. I stood slowly and gathered my purse. At 71 years old, I had learned that some lessons do not need to be explained. They simply need to be experienced. As I prepared to leave, Jason finally looked up at me. There was something different in his eyes now. Not anger. Not resentment. Something closer to regret. Mom, he said quietly. The single word carried more weight than any speech could have. I paused and waited. He looked down before continuing. I think I got lost somewhere along the way. For a moment, I saw flashes of the little boy who used to wait by the front window for his father to come home from work. The boy who built snow forts in the backyard and brought me dandelions he thought looked beautiful. Life changes people. Success changes people. Fear changes people. Sometimes they do not even realize it is happening. I nodded gently. We all lose our way sometimes. Melissa remained silent. I did not hate her. That surprised me more than anything. For weeks I thought this story was about property, inheritance, and money. Standing there in that conference room, I finally understood that it was about something else entirely. It was about values. Richard understood that long before any of us did. He never cared who received the house. He cared about the kind of people they chose to become while pursuing it. A few days later, I sat on the back porch watching the last leaves fall from the maple trees. The air was crisp and cool. Winter was approaching. In many ways, so was a new season of life. The trust arrangement ensured that I would remain secure. The house would remain mine. The future Richard and I built together would not be dismantled by impatience or entitlement. Yet what mattered most was not what I kept. It was what I learned. Grace joined me that afternoon, carrying 2 cups of coffee. We sat in comfortable silence for several minutes. Finally, she smiled and asked, "Do you feel like you won?" I thought about the question carefully. Then I shook my head. No. She looked surprised. I smiled. Richard won. She laughed softly. That sounds like something he would appreciate. Maybe it was. Because Richard never set out to defeat anyone. He simply trusted that truth eventually reveals itself. And it had. Over the following months, Jason visited more often. Not because he had to. Because he wanted to. The conversations were awkward at first. Healing usually is. Trust takes longer to rebuild than it takes to break. But little by little, genuine effort replaced assumptions. Real listening replaced expectations. As for Melissa, she remained distant for a while. Eventually, she apologized. Not perfectly, not dramatically, just honestly. At this stage of life, I have learned that sincerity matters more than perfection. One evening, nearly a year after Richard's passing, I found myself standing in his study once again. The grandfather clock downstairs marked the hour. The house felt peaceful. I opened the desk drawer and reread the final note he left behind. Eleanor, if they are celebrating now, it means they still have not found the line. I smiled. The line had never really been about legal language. It was about character. It was about responsibility. It was about remembering that family is not measured by what you inherit, but by how you treat the people who helped build your life. I carefully folded the note and returned it to the drawer. Then I turned off the light and walked into the hallway. The house was quiet, but it no longer felt empty. Richard's greatest gift was never the trust, the amendment, or the property. His greatest gift was the final lesson he left behind. They thought the inheritance was the treasure. They were wrong. The real treasure was the family they nearly lost while chasing it.